Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Gidon Eshel, research professor of environmental physics at Bard College, is our distinguished guest on today's podcast. Dr. Gidon also runs the website environmentalcalculations.com. Dr. Gidon Eshel is an environmental physicist whose research bridges agriculture, climate science, and public health. His work has fundamentally advanced our understanding of how dietary and agricultural choices impact the planet, examining the environmental footprint of livestock production, water usage, nutrient pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. Beyond qualifying these impacts, Dr. Eshel develops innovative analytical framework that simultaneously optimize both human health and environmental sustainability through dietary interventions. Currently at Bard College, Dr. Eshel leads collaborative research through Redcliffe with Harvard University Center for the Environment and Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Together, they are developing integrated metrics that assess multiple environmental dimensions, greenhouse gas emissions, water and land use, alongside critical health outcomes including cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, and metabolic diseases. This multi-objective approach enables scientists and policymakers to design interventions that improve public health while reducing environmental burden. Dr. Essel's academic foundation spans physics and earth sciences at Israel's Technion and University of Haifa, followed by advanced training at Columbia University, where he earned an MA, MPhil, and PhD in mathematical geophysics. His career has been distinguished by prestigious fellowships and leadership roles, including NOAA Climate and Global Change Postdoctoral Fellow at Harvard, a staff scientist position at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and faculty membership in the Department of Geophysical Sciences at the University of Chicago. In this episode, Dr. Gidon Eshel shares insights from his newly published book, Planetary Eating: The Hidden Links Between Your Plate and Our Cosmic Neighborhood. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Gidon Eshel to the conversation. Dr. Eshel, we are deeply honored with your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Professor, you describe dietary choices as our principal form of planetary agency. Can you explain why the food we eat has such a profound impact on the planet and how most people underestimate this connection?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I like to think to start by asking people to think of viewing Earth from space, from a satellite or from the International Space Station, um, not at the dark side at night, but during the day. What you see is mostly geographical features, mountains, large lakes, oceans, etc. But if you look more carefully, you see one and only one aspect of our fingerprint, human fingerprint, and that is agriculture. In other words, one element of the whole totality of our very varied pursuits is the one and only that you can see from space. That gives people a sense, I think, of just how pervasive and ubiquitous our tentacles are when it comes to impacting and modifying for our benefits the Earth's surface. Eh, I think very few people really understand this. Most people, I think, nowadays do understand that dietary choices have a very significant impact on how much greenhouse gas emissions our diets are associated with. But really, the impact goes far beyond that. For example, agriculture, poorly managed agricultural lands, are the single dominant source of all water pollution in the world. And in addition to complete dominance over the land use, and very significant contribution to emissions, that is planetary agency. Now, on top of that, you have uh, a very large range of impacts that individuals can exert on the planet. What I mean is you can have two people eating, let's say, the same number of calories and the same amount of protein per day, but one of them will eat only, let's say, a little bit of plants and lentils and chickpeas, let's say, um, and another one will have the mean American diet, and the latter will require 10 to 50 times, not percent, but times, 10 to 50 times as much resources as this one who eats lentils, chickpeas, and a little bit of greens. Because of this very large spectrum of possibilities, diet is quite unique. For example, you can't find two cars that are emitting in which one is emitting 50 times as much greenhouse gases as another. No, you see a factor of 4, 3, something like that, not 50. That's why diet is so important, yet, as you correctly point out, underappreciated in its contribution to our environmental footprint.
Professor, in the book, you address the contradictory advice people receive about sustainable eating. What are the most common misconceptions about healthy and environmentally friendly food that you felt compelled to correct?
The most pervasive and unfortunate mistake is the belief that some have that some types of beef are acceptable environmentally, and some may go even further and suggest that they are in fact desirable from an environmental standpoint because they achieve certain goals. That is incorrect. There is not an element in this argument that is correct. Now, I want to emphasize this. The reason people arrive at this emphatically erroneous conclusion are not absurd. They are not silly. They make sense. They just aren't quantitatively the ones that matter most. What I mean by that, for example, people say, many people believe that eating beef derived from cows that grazed on open land, that is environmentally desirable. For example, some people believe because it promotes uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere by the vegetation, thereby taking radiatively active carbon and putting it below ground as radiatively inert carbon. There is meager and contradictory evidence for that. Mostly, as best we know, you add cattle to the land and you reduce significantly the land's ability to take up atmospheric CO2. At the very least, even if you contest this result, at the very least, there is not a shred of evidence, except in very rare and specific instances, that cattle grazing promotes carbon uptake by grasslands. That is, I think, the single most important mistake that people make. There are others. I mean, some people go into another extreme and say all animal based foods are an environmental calamity. that is not true. I mean, a person can eat, let's say, chicken, certainly eggs, and be in very good environmental standing. Um, some people fixate, very commonly, people fixate on local food. Has the food traveled a great deal? That is unimportant. I mean, of course, all else being equal, if you have this tomato and they are identical in every way except that this one came from far away, then it may be that this one is superior, the one that came from down the road, because it traveled less. But there are so many ways to make that reverse. For example, even the difference in efficiency of trucks that are used for local delivery versus the relatively efficient modes of transportation over long distances, even that is enough to reverse the calculus. In other words, uh, driving, let's say, 60 kilometers in a very inefficient truck may be equivalent to many, many hundreds of miles in a modern, efficient long distance truck. And therefore, this is just unimportant.
Professor, how do agricultural patterns directly shape planetary health? And what surprised you most when examining the geophysical consequences of different food systems?
So, diet affects planetary health. When we say planetary health, I guess we mean two things at once. We mean how our diet impacts our own bodies, as well as the environmental consequences of our diet. So we have planetary health, healthy planets. It kind of straddles both dimensions of the problem. Um, you get to great impact on on planetary health by noting that people can eat in ways that promote and preserve their health, or in alternative ways that actively undermine their health. And in general, but not always, there is a nice alignment between the type of eating that promotes one's health and the type of eating that promotes one's impact on the planet. They generally are similar, but not perfectly. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, Professor. Professor, you write from a planetary science perspective rather than a nutritional or environmental advocacy perspective. How does this
Yeah.
approach change the way we should think about dietary decisions?
Right. Yes, you're absolutely right that I prefer to look at environmental consequences of agriculture and diet, not from the standpoint of traditional environmental science, which is very, very powerful. Okay. I have nothing against environmental science whatsoever. But I think that an even more powerful perspective can be had if you take the time to study the basic planetary processes that agriculture disturbs or disrupts, and to try to understand their physics, sometimes chemistry, sometimes a little bit of biology, to try to understand the underlying governing science so as to more fully appreciate the fundamental science roots of some of those problems. So, for example, Um, Sorry, 1 second. Luna, stop. Um, for example, you can think of irrigation as simply using and sometimes wasting water naturally, right? But you can also think more fundamentally about the planetary scale hydrological cycle and how those small, seemingly small diversions of water from here to there, etc., how those um, are elements, building blocks in the whole much broader and more fundamental story of the planetary hydrological cycle. That offers a far better and far more comprehensive view and perspective on the way agriculture impacts Earth.
Professor, for listeners trying to make wise dietary choices, what are the top three scientifically grounded principles they should use to evaluate whether a food is truly sustainable?
Uh, the most important thing is to avoid beef. That is number one by far. It's extremely important because beef, in any form, is a very resource intensive source of food, and therefore replacing it with less intensive alternatives is extremely beneficial. Let me put some number to illustrate the point. Imagine for a minute that the entire population of the US decided to forego beef. One change and replace it with alternative sources of protein and energy. That dietary shift alone will allow the US to feed 140 million additional people. The US population is only 340 million or so. So 140 additional million Americans is a very large achievement, and it only takes replacing one element of the diet, which really does not contribute that much. Maybe, um, typical American eats somewhere between 10 and 15 grams a day. That's it. It's not that much. And we don't, we only get like 4 grams of protein a day from beef. It's not much, but it will completely change the landscape of the US, and it will allow 140 additional people to be fully sustained. In the context of there being about 0.8 billion people on Earth who are hungry on an average day, to have 140 million out of those 800 million be completely sustained, that's a shocking achievement in only one country. That's why avoiding beef is the single most impactful dietary change a person can adapt voluntarily. Um, if you want to go beyond that, of course, replacing all meat and then all animal products in decreasing ranking of urgency are very beneficial. And then, even if you only eat plants, which is in general the least impactful way you can eat, even then, there are plants that there is a lot of variability within plants. So, um, chickpeas, lentils, grains, those are extremely low impact ways to eat. If you eat a lot of green vegetables, in some places it becomes somewhat problematic because of water consumption. In general, it's very desirable, but there are limitations on that. It's not free, environmentally speaking, primarily because vegetables are, at least in the US and in Israel also, are mostly grown in uh, pretty arid places that entirely depend on irrigation. And that means much heavier involvement of humans in the ways and the specific functioning of the hydrological cycle. That is not nearly as impactful as eating beef, but it can add up to somewhat undesirable effects.
Professor, your work has compared livestock in terms of land use, water use, and emissions. Can you walk us through a specific comparison? For example, how does beef production compare to plant-based alternatives from a planetary perspective?
Yeah, so we touched on that earlier. There is, in general, as a rule of thumb, not perfect, but as a rule of thumb, you can say that in terms of the consumption of any one of the resources that agriculture dominates the use of, which is um, nitrogen fertilizer, irrigation water, cropland occupation, and greenhouse gas emission. In terms of those four, um, switching from beef to plants, or from beef to plants with a little bit of eggs, let's say, and maybe chicken, that, in as a rule of thumb, lowers your impact somewhere between an order of magnitude and 50-fold. Um, I mean, 50-fold, just to make it clear to the reader. Imagine a medium skyscraper, 50-story high skyscraper, not the Empire State Building, not the Dubai skyscrapers, but a sizable tall building. Now imagine one-story house and compare those two. That's a factor of 50 difference. And that's how much that's at most how much your environmental impact can be reduced by switching from beef to alternatives, and then from somewhat better alternatives to even better ones.
Professor, many people assume that local or organic automatically means more sustainable. Does your research support or challenge this assumption, and why?
Yes, very good question. And no, I'm afraid that is not supported. Local, we already touched on, and basically it's not really significant. Um, the the reason is as follows: the variability between the very efficient farms and the very inefficient farms in how much resources are used during the production process, those differences are so vast that they more than compensate for the transportation, even across the US, from, let's say, Seattle to Boston. And even if you do it in a relatively inefficient mode of transportation, such as an 18-wheeler or something like that, it is still just unimportant. Okay. Now, what about organic? The other part of your question. In general, um, it is clear that some types of plant-based foods are unfortunately very high in residue agrochemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc. And some of those are carcinogens, etc. The knowledge on that is somewhat imperfect, I would say, but the precautionary principle, if applied to this, will say, well, I mean, if those are mostly either known or suspected carcinogens, I would not really wait a great deal until crystal clarity about whether they are emphatically carcinogenic. I would avoid eating them. And organic is favoring organic over conventional is 1 second, sorry, Luna.
Sure.
Luna. Uh, uh, One way to avoid the ingestion of those highly suspect agrochemicals is to favor organic because the use of many of the worst offenders is simply prohibited in the organic practice. But there is a rub here. It's not obvious. Here's why. In general, not universally, but in general, eating organic means that you use more cropland. And all else being equal, that is not a desirable thing. So now there is a tension here between, oh, I want to protect my own health by avoiding ingestion of agrochemical residues. And in doing so, I'm undermining planetary integrity by occupying more land than I need. The truth is that the effect is not very large. In other words, I would say if we said 10-15% yield penalty for organic, we will be roughly right. And that means that a person who eats organic needs 10 or 15% more land than the person eating the same diet, but not organic. But 10 or 15% should be compared to the 30 or 50 fold more land than that eating beef requires. So, by comparison to, let's say, 30 fold, which is 3,000%, by comparison to 3,000, 10 is really minuscule. Okay. So that is the correct numerical perspective on that. But here is the rule of thumb that I think will help most of our listeners. If you eat something that's quite expensive, probably eating organic is a good idea. For example, arugula, fine lettuce, radicchio, all of those, what we call here fancy greens, okay? Mustard greens, those fetch a good amount of money, and therefore it pays to really pamper them. Pampering them in modern farming parlance typically means heavy dosage of agrochemicals. Then the organic is clearly warranted. But if you eat a diet that at its foundation relies on the most sensible foundation, which is chickpeas, lentils, basmati rice, maybe some grains like buckwheat or oats or farro or millet cereals. If your diet constitutes primarily these, think about how little buying a 5 kilogram sack of brown basmati rice is in a nice Indian store in Cambridge or in New York. It's very, very affordable, and therefore it is highly unlikely that in the process of producing them, they used a lot of agrochemicals. So when I buy lentils, I have no interest in organic. Chickpeas, no interest. Brown basmati rice, no interest. When it comes from China, I don't know enough about Chinese methods of production to know if this rule really applies. And so if I were faced with only one option from China, I would probably still favor the organic. But in the US, all of those things, I don't bother with organic at all. But strawberries or blueberries or raspberries or arugula or lettuce, absolutely, I do.
Professor, what role does individual dietary choices play in addressing larger systematic agricultural problems? And where do you see the greatest opportunity for impact as a personal level?
The biggest, I fear that we're coming back to it because your questions kind of ask revisit the same issue, the important issues from different angles. Um, so, without beating a dead horse, as they say, the biggest opportunity to further your own health and further planetary health is to forget about beef. Now, if you are rich enough to eat only beef produced in unmanicured rangeland, then from the standpoint of your own health, the question is not really that clear. There clearly are some benefits to eating such beef, and there are some liabilities. And I think we don't really know enough yet about dietary intake of cholesterol and saturated fat to really say definitively. But the conventional mainstream American beef is without question very deleterious to one's health. It's associated with elevated odds of several major killers like stroke, like cardiovascular disease and heart attack, some types of cancer, colorectal being one of them, and avoiding that type of beef is an excellent way to further your own health and lower your impact on planetary health.
Professor, you have developed multi-objective metrics that balance health outcomes with environmental impacts. How can individuals and policymakers use these tools to make better decisions about food systems?
Yeah, that's a really good and important point, and it's slightly geeky, let's say, or technical. Okay, so here, let me introduce that by giving you a real life dilemma that addresses the issue. Suppose I run into a person and she tells me I would like to improve my diet from a nutritional standpoint, and I would also like to lower my environmental impact. And therefore, I decided to double my intake of lettuce. Ah, Interesting. Very, very nice. Now, tell me, where do you get your lettuce from? Well, in the US, the answer is almost exclusively from the Central Valley of California. Okay, so now you have doubled your intake of something that causes very serious local environmental damage because the southern part of the Central Valley of California is very water limited, and they pump from underground aquifers, and those in return steadily decline. And that's a major environmental problem, has been for a while, and worse, has becoming worse in recent years. So here is our dilemma. You want to promote your health, and you think your diet previously was deficient in dark green leaves, therefore you double your intake of lettuce, but in doing so, you double your impact on a very serious environmental problem locally, which is depletion of aquifers in the southern Central Valley of California. Okay, so then this lady is confused. She thought she read Planetary Eating and she's following my advice. And here I am telling her, having followed my advice, I'm telling you that you are now causing double the impact on a pretty serious local environmental problem. What is a woman to do? So that's where multimetric balancing comes along. This is what I mean. If her doubling her lettuce consumption replaces consuming beef or dairy, then that new choice lowered markedly her emissions, right? Because she switched from beef to lettuce, high emission, low emission, all is good. But she also doubled her impact on the local water scarcity. Multimetric optimization means how do we balance all of those distinct forces such that we will get to one outcome, one dietary shift favor this in lieu of that, that demonstrably, optimally furthers your own health and lowers your minimizes your environmental impact.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. As we face converging challenges of climate change, resource scarcity, and public health crisis, how should we reimagine our relationship with food and agriculture over the next decade?
Yeah, that's a really good and very hard question. So I would say that we need there is a built-in tension between two competing models of doing agriculture. One is major agribusiness cultivating huge swaths of land and maybe buying much more land, let's say available in Africa or in Brazil or in rising emerging economies, versus something small scale, local, kind of more, let's say, locally benign. And each one of those competing models have very, very loud advocates on either side. And the advocates of either one of those tend to deride very dismissively the alternative model as either unrealistic or as environmental apocalypse and so forth. I think that there is clearly lessons to learn from either of those. For example, industrial agriculture perfected some aspects of optimizing production per unit input, per dollar capital investment, per hour of labor, per cubic meter of water, per ton of CO2 emitted, and on and on and on. And given that all of those resources are finite, it behooves us to optimize their use, and that industrial agriculture has very important lessons to teach us about. On the other hand, some of their practices are so manifestly environmentally unsound, and they give rise to processes that are so manifestly unsustainable that we must abolish those from industrial agriculture, even though we know that abolishing them will lower their productivity a little bit. I'll give you an example. Modern agriculture is very antithetical to preserving topsoil. It uses topsoil very wastefully, and we have gone through a third, in some places 60% of all the topsoil that we have. That's obviously not sustainable. The topsoil of Earth, the mineral part of it, was created over 10,000 or 18,000 years, okay? And it only took us about 2.5 centuries of large-scale agriculture to get rid of about half. That's not, obviously not sustainable. The more benign small-scale cultivation does not suffer from that. Quite the opposite. In many cases, it actually promotes soil production. The price that you pay for that is low productivity. There are some ways that those can be combined optimally, those two radically, diametrically opposite models. And I wrote papers that show two different methods of doing that. The details of those are really technical and are beyond our scope here. But clearly, if I was able to highlight two independent ways of balancing those models, others, just as smart as I am or smarter, will come up with additional ways. I think the ways I came up with are good, but they do not corner the market. There is much more knowledge to be added. But the basic challenge of all of those proposed solutions will be to take the best of industrial agriculture and the best of local small-scale environmentally benign agriculture and to wed them into a system that promotes human health and promotes planetary integrity.
Thank you, Dr. Eshel, for translating complex planetary science into practical wisdom we can call all news. Your message is clear. Dietary choices matter, and armed with the right scientific framework, we can nourish both ourselves and our planet. We hope listeners will explore planetary eating and will bring these insights to their tables and communities. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure.